Are China-U.S. relations headed for a long, freezing winter with no icebreaker in sight? What was the ballast of ties between the world's top two economies in 2022? How would that shape the world in 2023 and beyond? Welcome to part one of a special year-end edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. We'll take a look back at altogether 7 important moments in diplomacy between Beijing and Washington to better understand the story. Some are more encouraging, others far less so. I will ask my guests what they think of U.S.-China engagement in the past year, but I will keep the last question open. I'm pleased to be joined from Beijing by Zoon Ahmed, journalist and research fellow with the Center of China and Globalization think tank. From Berlin, Germany, by Professor Huang Jing, University Professor and Director of the Institute of the U.S. and Pacific Studies at the Shanghai International Studies University. Also, Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at Robert Bosch Academy, and Dr. Li Cheng, Director of the John L. Thornton China Center and Senior Fellow of the Foreign Policy Program with Brookings Institution. The warmest welcome to all of you to The Point. I would like to start with the first event that caught our attention between China and the United States, which is the marking of the 50th anniversary of former U.S. President Nixon's visit to China, as 2022 marked the 50th anniversary of that occasion. That visit took place in 1972, in February 1972, and it resulted in the joint Shanghai communique that became the political foundation of diplomatic ties between China and the United States. Earlier this year, I spoke to Stephen Orlins, president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, about that occasion. Let's listen in first.
What was so amazing about the Shanghai communique, as I went back and read it over the last few days again, is it starts off at saying, we have different social systems and foreign policy. We don't agree on all this, but we believe it's in the interest of world peace to have these breakthroughs. And then they laid out the basis on which they can go forward, and they established liaison offices in each other's capital. Today, that's, oh, that was ordinary. It wasn't ordinary. It was truly brave, truly extraordinary. So what I hope today, as our relationship has such difficulty, is leaders on both sides can look over the horizon and say, we're going to disagree on our political systems. We're going to disagree on foreign policy. But the importance of confronting our common challenges outweigh those disagreements, and we need to find a way to work together.
Zoon, let me go to you first. It's almost like a godsend that, the year 2022 started with this very important moment to recall what happened 50 years ago. What was the lesson that you think that visit taught us, and that is of particular significance today?
I think, first of all, Liu Xin, thank you so much for having me on this program. I mean, especially when we are looking at a year 2022, which has been absolutely decisive, in some ways divisive, and also significant for China, U.S., and the global South at large. So the interesting thing is, I mean, as a Pakistani, we also really talk about that visit. Pakistan was an ally of the U.S. and also we had a good relationship with China. And for many countries, developing countries, especially, it was an important development. It was a development that, would bring a major country, China, which a lot of global South countries had strong sympathies with, strong relatability with, within, a fold of greater, I wouldn't say acceptability, but broader opportunities. So that said, I mean, I think Professor Huang and Professor Cheng, maybe they can highlight more on the bilateral level. But my view is that, of course, 50 years ago, when this happened, this development, I don't think it was anything but a very pragmatic move on part of the U.S., given at that time the complications within Asia. There was obviously a bigger threat at that time to U.S. interests globally. And at that time, it was a very pragmatic, practical decision to, warm ties with China. And that led to immense opportunities for countries at large. But we do realize that even though ideological differences were set aside, there was a hope in Washington that China, when they economically liberalize, eventually they will also politically follow the same path as the US did. And that was obvious during Bill Clinton's own speeches in 2000 and 2001 when China was entering the WTO as well. So I think, long story short, I think that, of course, ideological differences can be bridged. We are living in a world where increasing number of countries are talking about the fact that different governance systems suit different histories, different circumstances. But at the same time, it's also important to see that we are in a better position to not follow the same trajectory as Western countries. And I think the fact that this was possible at a time of relative, caution in Washington to put those differences aside and say, let's work on our commonalities, let's accept that we have differences and let's move forward on mutually beneficial path forward. I think that mindset is possible again. I think 50 years on.
That is your opinion. Professor Huang, is it still possible? It seems that leaders today are less pragmatic and the ideological differences seems to looms larger between China and the United States. Is that observation correct?
Yes, I do not believe that U.S.-China relationship will take a turn for good in the short term. I'm not very optimistic. When President Nixon visited China in 1972, three conditions there, but none of them existent today. Number one, there is very strong Soviet Union, which seems taking upper hand in international affairs in early 1970s. And number two, China is so much weaker than United States. China would not form any kind of threat economically, politically, and militarily towards the United States. And number three, China is still isolated at that time. The majority of the country in this global village did not recognize China, but recognize the other side of the Taiwan Strait. But nowadays, none of those three conditions still exist. Number one, there's no stronger or strong common enemy. The Soviet Union has long disintegrated. And number two, China is so much stronger, almost equally strong as the United States. Make the United States feel threatened. Economically, politically, and militarily. And last but not the least, China is one of the countries which deeply integrated with our international system. And ironically, this international system is also the one that where the United States power is rooted in. So that makes the whole situation even more complicated. In that case, given the great uncertainty of US politics today, I do not believe that the relationship could improve in the near future.
Dr. Li, what is your take? Is that the rosy, good old days that we can never get back? Or is there still something to be taken from those days and to whichever extent you can to be used for what people can do today because we have to?
Well, it largely depends on how the events next year and the future to unfold. But first of all, I wanted to convey my warm New Year greetings to you and Liu Xin and to other panelists and to your audience in China and around the world. It has been a challenging and very tough year for many of us. Now, as we are all keenly aware, we live in perplexing and worrying times. Some parts of the world are experiencing bloody wars and horrific famines. Most continents are confronting serious economic slowdown and stark inequalities. And the whole globe is going through the COVID pandemic and the climate crisis. Seeing pandemic, war, and famines, these most terrible things in human history are all with the earth we live today. Now, but at the same time, we also have something to be cheerful in this memorable year. For China, the very impressive Beijing Winter Olympics and the Paralympics, and also the millions of fans for the recently held Soccer World Cup. I mean, these international gatherings reflect the uplifting spirit for cross-cultural respect and for our shared global destiny. We are certainly looking forward to the final arrival of the post-COVID era next year. Now, for your question, I think that Steve Allen was right when we look back to what Nixon and Kissinger did 50 years ago. Culture, education, economic, diplomatic exchanges between two countries with profoundly different ideologies and the political systems can promote mutual understanding and goodwill and diffusing global norms, and therefore reduce the likelihood of military conflict. Now, of course, that I share Huang Jing's sentiment that we live in a different world, that the previous foundations are gone. Right. The Biden administration is known for its coalition building, geopolitics, and value-based bloc. The different standards that the U.S. and China have taken on Russian-Ukraine war, and expanding rhetoric about democracy versus authoritarianism in the Western, mainly in the Western countries, have reinforced Washington's perception of global bifurcation. So that certainly is a challenge that we need to deal with.
Well, you mentioned the Ukraine war. Let's go straight to the second moment, which is really perhaps the most consequential moment of the past year in almost every sense, which is the war in Ukraine, which broke out in February. And I had the opportunity to have an exclusive interview with former Belarusian Foreign Minister Vladimir Makey that was conducted early March. He was announced, unfortunately, to have died suddenly in November, but he predicted the disastrous consequences of stepped up Western sanctions on Russia and Belarus.
They claim to support the sovereignty and independence of Belarus, but in fact, all these sanctions are aimed at completely undermining the sovereignty and independence of Belarus and shaking the state system of Belarus. Therefore, we absolutely cannot accept them. We will naturally respond to these sanctions against Belarus. These sanctions are totally illegal. These sanctions are not endorsed by the Charter of the United Nations or based on any other international agreements. How will things develop? You can imagine what will happen next. As I said, the least bit of rationality has been completely abandoned. What will be the impact on the world economy and the economy of individual countries? We have already seen fuel and energy prices rise in some countries.
So let me go back to Zoon. Keep it very short, please.
Okay.
He was right. I mean, in March, he was already predicting the energy and the economic crisis that countries would face. How big of a factor was it on China-U.S. relations, in your understanding?
Okay, so I think firstly, I'll very quickly clarify that I am on the same page with Professor Cheng and Professor Huang that we cannot see this ideological gap. I mean, we're in a very different world. Today, China poses a different kind of challenge to US dominance in the world. But what I do believe is that we are living in a world where regions like Europe, East Asia, I mean, different parts of the world consider that we need to coexist despite our differences. That said, I think the Russia-Ukraine war was decisive in pushing European bloc closer to the United States in making, at this time, President Biden, his administration's quest to work with allies to strengthen alliances with traditional partners and to really, I mean, escalate this concept of, we need to stick together in order to fight against the authoritarian threat that is escalating globally.
All right.
What happened as a consequence, in my humble view, is that they were able to, I mean, despite the fact that China's position right now is one that is shared by a predominant number of the world's countries, they say de-escalate. And also we have seen other wars recently. I mean, this is not of course, the consequences are much broader.
Yeah, but I'm going to interrupt them. I'm going to ask for Professor Huang and Dr. Li's view. What do you see as the impact, especially the long-term impact of this war in bilateral ties? Professor Huang.
Of course, this war, first and foremost, will weaken Russia further. And that's, I think everybody would agree with that. But on the other hand, it also will weaken the United States and its allies. I would think that I've been here for a while. I think that the gap between Europe countries, especially Western European countries and the United States, just began to be exposed. Because first, nobody knows what this war is about. After the article published by President Biden on May 31st on New York Times. And European leaders are very confused because according to the 4 red lines, lined out by President Biden, European leader would ask what we're fighting for. If we are not going to defeat Russia and we're not going to end this war, we just keep fighting, and who is going to support us first? And second, for China also in a very difficult situation. This will confirm that Russia as a global power is because Russia has a massive capacity of destruction. But China is trying to project image of contributor and a builder to the international world. In other words, China tried to contribute to a global village, but Russia now has proved to everyone that it is a destructive power. But last but not the least, I'm sorry, I think China is a difficult situation because the United States, until this day, still making China the most consequential challenges to the United States and US-led international order. So if this is still there, it will be very difficult for China to kind of do something positively to end this war, even though first China has nothing to do with the making of the war, and China is now part of the war. But China does want to be part of the solution if the conditions are right. But now the conditions are not right. What if China helped the United States and the allies to end this war, and United States and Europe will take the momentum, take on China? Of course, that makes China very difficult. But on the other hand, China also want, okay, I'll stop it.
Yeah, Dr. Li, your view on the impact of the war on bilateral ties between China and the United States.
Well, the impact is not only the end of the post-Cold War international order, the complete collapse of that order, but also highly likely that means the end of economic liberalization that we have seen in the past half century. So that's the stake. It's a huge. Certainly,
you mean the economic liberalization or globalization?
Economic liberalization come to end. You do see that the bifurcation or polarization start to emerge. You see that even without that event, the economic liberalization faces some challenges because growing inequalities within country and between countries become really out of control. But the Ukraine war certainly accelerated that process. Now, this is the issue certainly is beyond the U.S.-China relations. Now, China agrees that China did not benefit from the Russian-Ukraine war, and China has a good relationship with Ukraine. I mean, as we all know. But of course, for China's own positions, it does not want to condemn Russia, and also China does not believe economic sanction. Yet, I also noticed that China has some recent shift for the previous rhetoric about off limits, no forbidden zone. At least the ambassador to U.S. Cheng said very clearly, China has a bottom line, and the bottom line is the United Nations Charter and etc. So also it's welcome to see that China does not sell weapons to Russia. But I hope that China will do more because the stake is so high. There's a threat of imminent threat of nuclear war. Right. And also that I certainly think Huang Jing made a good point that China is hesitant, and also certainly from China's interest, despite China's suffer from that war economically and also could be strategically. But China does not want to see Russia to be completely to be fatally defeated by NATO, because if that's the case, based on the current rhetoric in the United States, China will be the next target. So that explains China's hesitance. I think that for the Western world, we do need to understand China's position. But for China, I think that certainly should play more active role in terms of peace negotiation, and also give pressure on Russia about on various grounds.
We do have to keep in mind, and I think the former Belarusian foreign minister made a good point, that the sanctions are unilateral sanctions. Although they're taken by several countries, Western countries in particular, they're not endorsed or authorized by the United Nations. So let us not confuse the sanctions, unilateral sanctions confirmed by Western countries, a handful of Western countries, and sanctions that are endorsed under international law. But let's move on. We don't have that much time. I think the next moment we chose that I believe is of particular significance to bilateral ties is the Blinken speech at the George Washington University on this administration's approach to the PRC, which was given in May, where he called China the most serious long-term challenge to international order. I'm going to go to Professor Huang Jing. How significant is that moment? Is there a Biden doctrine emerging from that speech, or a Blinken doctrine emerging from that speech?
I think it's too early to tell it's a Biden doctrine or Blinken doctrine, but it does have some changes, or subtle but significant. Number one, we remember that when Blinken gave the first speech, he defined the U.S.-China relations with 3 C's, competition, cooperation, and conflict. But in the May speech, conflict disappeared. So only competition and possible cooperation. That's first. Second is emphasize the investment in the United States to kind of outcompete China. In other words, that's an indirect recognition that the United States needs to be fixed. That is the huge problems in the United States, economically, politically, and so on and so forth. So invest. And third one is that it emphasizes the strengths or importance of alliances, and so that it can work together on China. And I think the most important part in that part is that it emphasizes on value-based alliance system. I think it's a double-edged sword. It can be successful, but in my view, it will be very unsuccessful. Just take example. In United Nations, 141 countries condemned Russia for the war in Ukraine, but only 40 countries, all of them developed countries, with so-called same value, join the sanction. And the entire global South did not join. That tells how dangerous it could be if United States emphasize on value-based alliances, because, like I said, you're going to sanction yourself out. If 10 sanctions against 1, 7 against 3 is fine. Now it's a 4 against 6, and the value is the same. It is self-isolated approach, in my view.
I want to get Dr. Li's take on this, because this is an important moment. And do you also notice that the word conflict was taken out of it? Does it mean that the United States is taking a more rational approach to bilateral ties, or not really?
Well, I will not read that too much, and I think certainly there's some important adjustment. But in terms of technological decoupling and in terms of security issues, that certainly the even administration will not abandon the possibility of the conflict. But we do need to understand that from Trump to Biden and the 2 parties, 2 different presidents, we do see some continuity, although also there's some differences. But this reflects that the American sentiment about regarding China. I think this is related with a structure problem, rather than the one administration or one president. And the structure problem refers to 2 things. One is there has been a geopolitical and economic power shift. From U.S. perspective, we never experienced this kind of challenge or rivalry such as China, which really constitute a challenge economically, technologically, and militarily. And Soviet Union during the Cold War, it's different. It's largely military and maybe only selective technological area, but not economically. But China is comprehensive. This is one thing. So therefore, our peer institution, Rand Corporation, had a report last year. They claim that the competition is risky, but do not do so even riskier. So that reflects American sentiment. The second structure problem is related with American domestic politics. Both parties are so divided, and also we see that the American democracy experienced, the crisis January 6th, and the partisan politics is so divisive, and with along many other problems, economic disparity, racial tensions, cultural war going on. Now, if America is in good shape, we do not care that much about China's different political system and economic model. This is related with the early statement 50 years ago, because America was in much better shape. But now we face some challenges. So therefore, China's different political system and economic structure and the economic model become even more sensitive. So we do need to understand. Now, it does not mean that I think that the U.S.-China relation, like some scholars, my colleague in both China and United States said free falls. I would say it's a mutually reinforced spirals. But if it's a spiral, there's some bounds, there's some adjustment. I think the next year with Blinken's visit to China in January before probably China's Spring Festival, I think this is a great opportunity.